Don't they think that there might be something else that they should be talking about? Like as if it was a negative thing that they were talking about this person that they lost. And then I lost my brother. And my whole Facebook was just dedicated for years to the grief that I was experiencing and the sadness that I was feeling. So I had essentially turned into the person that I didn't understand, because again, I didn't understand grief. You know, I lost people, but I thought, you know, that's life. You lose people and then you get on with your life, until I realized sometimes you lose people that are the closest to you, and you don't just get on with your life, because that was your life. I think to date, it has been like, 9 years since my brother has passed, and my Facebook picture has been the same since the night that he passed away, which is a photo of my mom, my brother, and myself at my mother's birthday. I think what I have grown into as a person who values being empathetic, a person who just understands empathy a lot more than I did before I lost my brother. So I think the growth comes from not invalidating anyone else's experience and just providing space and community for people to be able to live in their experience, to be in their experience. And again, with the science of grief, it's all about, I don't care if you lost somebody 3 days ago or 30 years ago. This is obviously, or lost a thing, because it's not just about, one type of grief. So I think just understanding that, people are living the best they can in the moment that they are presented with. And sometimes that moment lasts a very long time. So just understanding people more, I think, was a part of my journey.
Thank you, Tasha. Sundari, you're also a recent author. And I'm just curious if the production of that book and the process behind that book, if you see that as transformation or growth based on your experiences.
Oh my goodness, yes. I mean, I just published that book this November. I'm 41 now, and I lost my mother at 27 and my father at 31. And I've been carrying that book in my soul since burying my father. And that book to me felt like a birth. It felt like a huge release of me wanting to put out there what I didn't have at the time. There was no guidebook for me. There was no book that was cutting through the bullshit, excuse my language, and just speaking to how frustrating and anger fueled and complicated caregiving and losing your parents was. And I think even as I was writing, I think there was for me, it was, looking at how much has happened over the last 14 years, how much I've shifted. At the time I was working as a PR girl for NFL teams and record labels, and now have spent the last 14 years as a birth and death doula and working in grief. And that's because of their transition. That's because of their death. I think, outside of just the book, I think it shifted me entirely. I think losing my parents broke my heart. It and I had to be rebuilt. I agree with what was said, that it made me much more softer and empathetic, but I think it also made me live much louder and bolder because time wasn't promised. And I saw that. And I think my career, whether it's in doula work or in wellness or with the dinner party, was birthed because it made me re-examine my purpose. I honestly sat down and was like, there is no way in hell I just went through 13 years of caregiving and 2 dead parents for no reason. Like, there has to be a reason for this. And for me, that was the shift. I decided to make a career out of the practices I've been raised with, and continue to sit in death every day. And it's hard work, but I always feel like their death transformed me, and now there's no going back. And I think there's a lot of beauty to be found in what is birthed in grief.
Thank you, Sundari. Bonnie, you've experienced some significant losses recently. Maybe you could share a bit about that and any type of transformation or growth that you've experienced.
I certainly can, and it's interesting because it feels recently, but my I experienced losses prior to that, but my first real understanding of the depth and impact was when my mother was killed in a car crash, but it was in fact 24 years ago. But it feels very much like yesterday. And I think that and the death of my father 5 years later really gave me a firm understanding, even though I had specialized in grief before that, of the multitude of ways that it impacts your life, the transformation of priorities. I loved what Sundari said about louder and bolder, about your activities, and because you realize life isn't promised for, and I come from a non-traditional family in many ways, and traditional in other ways, because I grew up in America in the 50s and the 60s. So you get what we're trapped in time in some ways. But I was so struck by how many people had opinions about what I must do to grieve. And since my family is, my father was the black sheep in some ways of his family, my mother was the black sheep in some ways of her family. So we're just very different. And so many people would say, but you must grieve this way. And that, in addition to social justice work that I also did in terms of multicultural counseling and educating myself around that, really made me say, okay, what are we forcing on people as a culture that doesn't provide community? Because I really think that what Tasha was talking about with she found this community of other grievers. And if we have a community that can support us and help hold us up in these losses, they don't know exactly what you're going through unless they've experienced major grief like this. And sadly, with the pandemic, many people are experiencing this. And it's a rough club to join, because the admission, the initiation rite is that you lose someone that you're attached to, or something. We're currently losing so many things. All of that is justice. I mean, getting out and being bolder and louder about what it is, what the work is that we do, has become more and more important to me. I also lost, oddly, I lost 3 friends who were murdered. One was a double murder, and the other was a friend here in town, who was, I was privileged to call him a friend, and in his, in all the aftermath of it, and the memorials and the various cultural things that came into it, I learned so much about how to be there for other people in my own grieving. And I think, the closest people to the deceased, or the closest attachment, the focus should go on helping hold them up, right? And one person said, well, the most unhelpful thing that's ever been said to me, I think, probably was, your mother died at a time that was really inconvenient for me. And you have to laugh, but because if you don't find some humor in, okay, this person was doing what they could do to be supportive, even if it was totally not supportive of me. So all of these experiences, and again, with my father dying, people said I needed to do it the way that they needed it to be done, which is not how my family's built. So,
Um, Bonnie, the words of like community of grievers that you mentioned just now, it's really resonating for me. And actually, I'm thinking now of your work, Sundari, with the dinner party and creating
Yes.
a community of BIPOC folks. And I'm curious what has been successful so far and what has been really challenging in that work.
Ooh, yes. So for those who aren't familiar with the Dinner Party is a nonprofit for those in their 20s, 30s, and 40s who have suffered significant loss. We used to meet in person. We have 4,000 tables across the US. Now, because of COVID, we meet through Zoom rooms and our events are through Zoom. The week after George Floyd was murdered, it became real apparent to me that there needed to be safer spaces for the BIPOC community. I think it wasn't that this was unknown, but it became we need to make this a focus, because it felt like the daily headlines, the constant mirroring of people who looked like us, who were being slain and there was no justice served. It was exhausting. To sit in spaces of grief and talk about your personal loss, but not be able to mention also how this played in culturally or how this played into your people, how this was triggering because he looked like your dad or your cousin. That also felt like you weren't being seen as an entire griever. And the grief conversation traditionally has been led by white women. And our tables within the dinner party had also shown that the community was mostly white women, and we had pockets of people of color who were sitting at white tables alone, talking about their loss, but trying to ignore the rest of the grief that was sitting on their shoulders. And so for me, it became about making tables that were affinity based so that people could sit with people that look like them and not have to explain that while also trying to grieve. It became necessary for me to create events that were for us, by us, and events that weren't about us having to show up and talk and show up and explain ourselves, but ones that allowed us to be held and led by healers, and to move emotion through the body with dance and yoga and breath work, because it felt like we traditionally have not been given the space to be as soft as is necessary. Truthfully, I don't think there's nothing I could complain about, as much as I will say that to do this work, I'm still a Black woman in a pandemic trying to serve Black people and people of color in a pandemic. There are times when it's exhausting. I'm a griever that also works in death every day. And so my wellness practice is built into my day, and I have to be very, very intentional about the balance that I carry. I'm also a birth doula. I take as many births as I take deaths because I need to have both ends in order to feel firmly planted. I would say the highlights have been watching this community thrive. I think, justice was fueling every step the BIPOC community took. And whether it was the absence of justice being served or the quest for it, there was a need to speak to how it was impacting how you healed, and whether it was connected to your personal loss or not. What you were watching on the news was definitely impacting how quickly you were able to move through your own trauma. And I think joining that and giving people the permission to do so and speaking to the elephant room is proved to be successful, and people are feeling held and seen, which I think is the most important thing we can do in this work, is give people space to do so.
Thank you. Tasha, what are you thinking?
I mean, just thinking about, and back to, my personal story, the absence of like justice, right? When my brother was killed, he was shot here in Detroit. He was shot 15 times, right? And I remember being one of the first people to get the call, show up to the crime scene. And, I am a sister that is grieving. and my brother is like lying on the ground underneath his truck in the middle of winter. And the first thing the police officer comes up and says to me before, like, I'm sorry for your loss, or what is your name, or anything, is what did your brother do for a living? Which already have, don't really understand why this matters right now while I'm looking at, like, my brother lying on the concrete, lifeless. So I already know how it's going to play out, right? So we're going through this journey, and I decide that I want to sit with the police officers. I say, like, oh, let me sit with you, because there's like information that I have that could probably like help you kind of solve this case. And while I'm sitting there in the office with the officers, one of the officers says to me, well, there was a lot of people that didn't like your brother, so anybody could have killed him, right? I'm like, okay, so this is information that I have to take back to my mother. But again, I'm grieving, she's a grieving mother, so we have to try to navigate our grief, and we're not detectives. We don't really have time to focus on this. And then I realized, like, maybe 2 years ago, maybe even a year ago, that I can never fully properly heal without any proper justice for my brother, right? So then I start to call the police station, right? I'm calling back to the officers, I'm calling back to the same police stations. We're literally getting have not received a phone call, like a dial back, to this day. And it's been a couple of years. It's just like, well, we'll get back to you. Well, the officers on lunch, well, this, well, that. And then I think of like how, my mother, how she has been grieving my brother. And I'm sure a large part of her grief, again, is similar to mine, but it's similar to a lot of, people of color or Black people in the world. You never receive justice. So you never, that wound can never fully heal. And I remember being in high school, teaching high schoolers, a few years ago, and I was teaching them poetry. And these kids would not show up to the poetry classes or the poetry readings. And I'm trying to figure out, like, why they won't show up to these readings, right? Then I realized that, oh, because these are kids that just lost their fathers, just lost their mothers, just lost their brothers. And I'm asking them to come and write poetry and being bothered by the fact that they're not doing it. But then on top of them just losing these people, these are Black kids, Black and brown kids, who are now trying to create justice on their own, creating another cycle of death, another cycle of absence, where someone else in their lives won't receive justice either. So I think, again, like, just from a very personal story, being Black, being brown in this country, thinking about grief without any semblance of justice, it almost feels like there is no full circle of healing.
Thank you, Tasha. Bonnie, I'm thinking about, maybe you can think back to the time on campus when you were providing counseling to folks in this, let's say, the summer or the fall of 2020. And I'm curious, with these, the pandemic of racial violence, the pandemic of COVID coming together, I'm curious what your reflections and memories are of that time and how you had to shift and transform your practice. Oh, Bonnie? Bonnie, you are unmuted. You are muted, I mean.
I'm muted. There we go. Well, good, because what I said was that's a long answer, but I really think, well, first off, early in the pandemic, a lot of the students on MSU's campus didn't quite realize, well, actually, a lot of people didn't realize how long, none of us knew how long it was going to be, or the devastating effects. What I heard early on was, well, this friend of mine's grandfather died, or and an inequity in my clients of color where they were having family members. I had one friend who was a minister, and she went and officiated at a funeral, and weeks later discovered that probably 8 people at the funeral had become ill the person who, the deceased had died of COVID. The mother of the deceased then died, and 8 other people, all of COVID, because they didn't realize what it was. So the amount of immediate grief on families was huge early on in BIPOC populations, Native American as well. And the thing that I heard from students a lot was the loss of life events. So they're simultaneously grieving the loss of life events and grieving more and more the loss of people. And the impact on me was I'm doing the same thing, where I'm early in the pandemic, I lost somebody I'd known for 20 years because he didn't test positive, so they wouldn't treat him. So balancing all of that, and anytime we're grieving, it also brings up all the past losses and even the historical losses that I've recently been reading my grandmother's, I think it's my grandmother's hands by Resmaa Menakem.
Yes.
And just talking about how all of us carry that historical trauma. And I think this pandemic, and then when May hit and the George Floyd murder happened, that just brought the level up, the level of anxiety of people. Very few people have actually witnessed someone passing away. Like we have the privilege sometimes to be with our loved one when they're breathing their last breath, but to watch a murder nationally televised in a way, all of my clients, that hit them to the core, and my clients of color even deeper, because that brought up the historical, and also I think it really pushed some activism, which was is a good thing in any way that you feel like you're feeling so helpless. In a pandemic, it's hard to be an activist. You know, I'm an old activist. I've been protesting forever, but I'm also a high risk person in terms of COVID. Am I going to go downtown and protest right now? Taking care of a 96-7-year-old woman? Probably not. Because so people are considering, who am I taking the danger to, at the same time that I want to do something. The image that is in my head is like just being stretched to all different directions, and it hurts. And I think my clients felt that, and I certainly have felt that. I think that balance and that acknowledgement, I mean, I really always think of what both Tasha and Sundari have said. People need to have a safe place to tell their stories. It's one of the things I have tried to provide as a therapist for many years, and provide ways, as my colleagues do here, to express those losses and those feelings in ways that are not necessarily always verbal. Because we feel the grief on so many different levels, on a social level, a physical level, an emotional level, cognitive level. Sometimes you just can't think. Spiritual level, and I'm probably missing one. Oh, behavioral. You know, I'm under this blanket now, all curled up in my apartment, and I'm a strong woman. I want to go out, should go out, but please bring me tea. You know, it's that mix of what you need And do you have the community to help provide it and allow you to express it?
Your mention of ancestral trauma, I'm thinking just now about what's going on in Ukraine, the forced migration, refugees. I have this sense that, so many of these folks are going to be living this generation to generation to generation. They've already experienced trauma living under a totalitarian regime, their parents and grandparents. Sundari, I'm curious, how ancestral trauma, ancestral grief comes up in the work that you've been doing.
Oh, I think it comes up a lot for me. In two ways. I think when you think about it from a biological standpoint, when you are in utero in your mama's belly, you are also, in a sense, you were carried by your grandmother, right? Because it's the same amount of eggs that we're born with will be carried for the rest of our life. So your grandmother carried you in utero and she carried your mother. We know that from a biological standpoint, when there is any harm done to the emotional body, we usually see it happen physically, right? The body tends to reflect what is happening emotionally. If you think that what was happening to your grandmother emotionally, she was carrying in her body and you were in a sense sitting in her room as well, to think that that does not pass on even from a biological standpoint is not really understanding how all of those things happen, right? Cells carry emotion. We know this because of sound frequency. We know this because of sound healing, that you could heal a cell based on the sound that it hears, which means you can harm a cell based on the sound that it hears. So just from the biological standpoint, what happened in your family has happened to you on a cellular level and must be addressed. I think on an emotional level, it's like we don't often think about the conversations that are happening in our dinner table around with our families, right? The things that we say in passing to our children, to our cousins, to our aunts and uncles, the things that our parents say in passing to us. Some of them are wonderful. Some of them are not so wonderful. A lot of how we were raised, a lot of how we were reared, a lot of our beliefs are steeped in what our parents or grandparents or whomever raised us also believed. That doesn't always mean that it's right, which means that we get a lot of their goodness, but we get a lot of their harm as well. I think that when we think about it from the collective, when we talked about the BIPOC community of how often we have had to bypass healing to move forward because we knew justice was never coming, means that as a collective, you don't ever stop to get softer. There is no stop to reflect. You have never given yourself permission, nor has your mama or your grandmama or your aunt ever given you permission to slow down because they didn't have that permission granted. That is a perpetual cycle that we continue to carry and teach and uphold. And at some point it takes, Bonnie mentioned being the black sheep, it takes the black sheeps of the families and the lineage to say, this stops with me. This is no longer helpful, right? And I think that when you have the people that decide to be the change makers in their lineage, it's how you heal ancestral trauma. But I think thinking that it can be done without setting it as an intention and without recognizing that, as great as Aunt Susie was, she also came with some shit, means that you're always going to be kind of stuck in that same place. And when I think of the future that comes after me, I like to think that I would like to have been the ancestor that shifted that. I think there's something that when it comes to healing, and I say this a lot to the BIPOC community, is to recognize where these practices came from and to reclaim them as yours. That is also ancestral. It didn't start with, and this doesn't matter your belief. A lot of times people mix religion and spirituality and say you cannot be one without the other, or spirituality is some sort of esoteric thing that you can't access, or it's only granted to white people or only granted to people with money. When the truth is, these are practices that are engraved into temple walls and have been done by our ancestry since the beginning of time. And there's a beautiful healing that comes when you recognize that we also understood peace and understood wellness and understood holistic medicine way back when. And if you can step into that ancestry, even if yours a few generations out is a little cloudy, if you can go all the way back and recognize how valuable they considered wellness to be, you are healing backwards and forwards. So I don't know.
Thank you. Thank you.
You're welcome.
I just want to acknowledge some of the postings in the chat that's been going on. I'm just going to read it out, and just I'm curious, Tasha, Bonnie, and Sundari, if there's anything that comes up for you in some of these statements or questions, please respond. So from Allison, what has arisen for me in listening is contemplating how the pervasive denial of death in our Western culture is a huge barrier to bringing the concept of justice and integrity into the experience of grief, and how to support those who are grieving, especially around the losses experienced by the BIPOC community. I have not been thinking about death denial, as a preventer to justice and healing. That is really interesting to me. I'm just curious what you guys think.
I have, in some of the research and things I've done around grief historically, I know in the industrial age, actually, when the immigrants came in the 1900s and went to work for Ford in particular, but probably any industrialist, one of the things they did was the I guess we'll call them the PR machine that was developed at that point, said things like it's the man's job to support his family by work and making money, because a lot of the immigrants had, well, many of the people who worked in the early factories, they had family traditions of, you take a month off to grieve, you take a week off to grieve, a year later you have a feast and you grieve again, and you acknowledge that it's still there. And industrial United States particularly, but I'm sure in Europe as well, they didn't like losing the workforce, so they started ad campaigns to keep the men at work at that point, and the women in the factories as well. That combined with a war, a pandemic, a depression, and then another war. I know that my parents, who were born in 1917, they had dealt with enough death. They just did not want to deal with death. So prior to World War, for sure World War I, but I think World War II, people who were grieving would put, in many communities, they'd put a black wreath on their door. They'd wear black for a full year. They'd do all these rituals that said to their community, I'm still grieving, be gentle with me. And there was so much grief in that, 30 years time space. I mean, there were more wars and things that came after that, but they just didn't want to deal with it. And I know when I was a child, I was not allowed in the hospital to see my grandmother when she was dying, because children shouldn't have to deal with that. Whereas when my father's grandparents and my mother's grandparents died, they were like in the house. So the combination of all these things coming together, I think, have really created a denial of death in many, many communities. I mean, I think in a faith community, often there's an acceptance of it. But there's also an expectation that, okay, now aren't you over that yet? Which is, it's not something you get over, it's something you transform and grow through.
You're reminding me now, Bonnie, of a group that we're involved with at Reimagine. They're called Evermore, and they are lobbying in Congress for bereavement, better bereavement policies. 3 days is not enough.
I just want to touch on that. You know, some of the work that we do at the dinner party is something called work labs. And that means that we go into organizations and teach them about grief, and teach managers how to effectively work in grief. And we work a lot with school districts, primarily because of school shootings. What we have found is that in each district, in each school, in each organization that we go into, they have no bereavement plan. They have no idea how many days they get. They have no idea who to call if somebody dies. I, as a death doula, get brought into organizations when somebody has passed, and they need their team to get back together quickly to be productive. So they need somebody to talk to them about grief. It's strange how uneducated we all are about it, about the thing that happens to every single one of us, right? Like how bizarre it is that we do not have a foundation for what happens within our organizations past the 3-day mark of how we're going to care for each other, right? It's bizarre that within families, there isn't a built-in system with how we show up for each other. You know, I look at this when we think about justice within yoga, there's something called karma yoga, this idea of serving, right? And serving because we know that at some point we will also need that yoga, that gift, that union to come back to us. And yet we see people in grief and death and we're all like, not me, like shame. And it's strange because you are absolutely going to face it. You're absolutely going to deal with it. If there's anything the pandemic should have told us is none of us are getting out of this without rubbing up against it. So why are we not making this conversation and the care of it and the healing from it real easy to have? Why are we not sitting down and breaking this down and asking people questions that might seem uncomfortable, but are necessary? Like, it's a strange thing that we're all still holding on to the days of the immigrant, the days of our ancestry of the big C and she died, let's be quiet, of the whisper that somebody has passed and let's move on. It makes no sense. It doesn't help us. It doesn't fit current times. And the denial is absolutely preventing healing. There's no way to heal if you're ignoring what's happening.
I think more conversations like this are critical to break this cycle. So I see that it's 1:45 my time now, Natasha. We're going to move into Sundari's meditation. Is that the plan?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I would keep this conversation going forever if we could. It's so interesting and so enlightening.
And I want to thank Bonnie, especially Bonnie. I'm not sure if you can stay with us, but I just do want to thank you for being part of this conversation with us and for your wisdom.
Always my pleasure. And really, I would love to just continue the conversation, you know, but I did just get a text. I do need to leave. So thank you. Thank you for including me, Tasha, and Andy.
And we're keeping you in our thoughts as you go.
Thank you. Thank you.